Something is happening in the Middle East right now that you need to understand. Not the sanitized cable news version, not the talking points, but the full unvarnished weight of what it actually means when missiles start raining down on a city of nearly 500,000 people, and the elected parliament of a nation has to abandon its chambers and sprint to a fortified bunker just to stay alive long enough to vote on a budget. Think about that for a second. The Israeli Knesset, the legislative body of the only democracy in the Middle East, the parliament that the United States has backed, funded, defended, and in many ways defined its entire foreign policy around for decades, has been interrupted repeatedly by the screaming wail of missile sirens. Members of the Knesset cast their votes from an alternate fortified auditorium because of those sirens, as the vote on Israel's largest ever budget was interrupted multiple times by warnings of incoming Iranian ballistic missiles. When the actual legislative process of a sovereign nation has to be moved underground because the skies above are filled with weapons of mass destruction, we are not talking about a regional flare-up. We are not talking about a tense moment in a difficult neighborhood. We are talking about a fundamental reshaping of the world order. And America is in the middle of it, whether most people in this country realize it or not. Now, here is what I need you to hold in your mind as we go through all of this together tonight, because I think context is everything here. This is not a story that started last week. This is not a story that started last month. This is the product of decades of geopolitical tension, of nuclear brinksmanship, of proxy warfare, of a United States foreign policy that has swung wildly depending on who sits in the Oval Office, and of an Israeli government that has been simultaneously fighting for its survival and making decisions that have left much of the international community breathless with alarm. What we are watching right now in real time is the violent collision of all of those forces, and the people paying the most immediate price for it are ordinary civilians ducking into bomb shelters in Tel Aviv while missiles tear gaping holes through apartment buildings above them. This war began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated joint missile attacks hitting multiple locations in Iran, following the breakdown of U.S.-Iran talks and negotiations. President Trump stated publicly that the attacks were part of an effort to destabilize the Iranian regime, and Iran, predictably, responded. Since the war began, locations across Israel have been subject to multiple retaliatory Iranian missile strikes, and for several days after the start of hostilities, Israeli airspace was entirely closed, disrupting flights from Ben Gurion Airport and shutting the country off from the world. Think about what that means in practical terms for ordinary Israelis. Schools closed, flights grounded, millions of people waking up every single morning not knowing whether today is the day the missile defense system fails to catch the one that lands on their block. And here is the thing that the headlines often miss, because headlines are built for brevity, and this story demands depth. Israel has one of the most sophisticated missile defense networks on the planet. They have Iron Dome, they have David's Sling, they have aero systems capable of intercepting ballistic missiles in the upper atmosphere. The United States has spent billions helping to build and maintain these systems, and yet, Iranian missiles have still managed to strike multiple positions across the country. The largest death toll came in a strike on March 1st that targeted a residential neighborhood in Beit Shemesh, killing 9 Israeli civilians when a missile struck directly into a bomb shelter inside a synagogue. Let me say that again. 9 people were killed inside a bomb shelter, inside the very place they ran to for safety. At least 2 interceptors were launched against that missile, and it was still a direct hit on the communal shelter, demonstrating the limits of Israel's missile defense network and showing that even reinforced shelters could be vulnerable in the most extreme circumstances. That detail right there, that a bomb shelter inside a synagogue filled with people seeking protection became a mass casualty site, that is not just a tragedy. That is a data point that tells you something profound about the nature of this war and the limits of technology when it confronts the sheer volume and persistence of sustained ballistic missile campaigns. And we need to understand who is doing the firing and what they are firing, because the specifics here matter enormously. By the 10th day of the war, Iran had fired a total of 300 missiles at Israel, nearly half of which carried cluster submunitions, weapons that spread dozens of explosive warheads over a radius of 6 miles, a practice that is banned by the Convention on Cluster Munitions, an international treaty signed by more than 100 nations, but notably not by Iran. Amnesty International has already condemned Iran's targeting of residential areas with these weapons. The executive director of the Arms Control Association called the Iranian targeting of cluster munition warheads at residential neighborhoods deliberate, saying that Iran appears to be launching them into relatively populated areas, probably with the goal of producing civilian harm. So we are talking about a state actor deliberately targeting civilians with internationally banned weapons. And the world is watching. And the question that should be front and center for every single American who cares about how their country engages with the rest of the world is this: what are we doing here? Why are we doing it? And what does it mean for us? Not just in the abstract geopolitical think tank sense, but in the real, concrete economic and moral sense that affects every American family? Because the answer to that question is far more complicated than the administration's official talking points suggest. The U.S. and Israel have battered Iran with nationwide strikes targeting military capabilities, leadership, and the nuclear program. Israeli and American leaders have also suggested that toppling the government was a goal, and Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed when the war was launched. Regime change. That is the stated objective, or at least one of them. The United States of America, under the current administration, made the deliberate decision to go to war with Iran with the explicit stated goal of toppling its government. And we did so without a formal declaration of war from Congress. We did so while simultaneously, and this is critical, dealing with Iran's counterstrikes that have spread far beyond Israel's borders. Iran has targeted Arab neighbors, disrupted oil supplies, and snarled global air travel. A tanker came under attack off the coast of Kuwait. Ships have been attacked in the Gulf of Oman and the Strait of Hormuz, through which about a fifth of the world's oil passes. And that has caused oil prices to soar. Do you understand what that means for the average American family? Every gallon of gas you pump, every plane ticket you buy, every product that gets shipped across the ocean. The cost of this war is already showing up in the American economy, and we have not even begun to reckon with what a prolonged conflict could mean for global energy markets that are already fragile after years of supply chain disruptions. Gulf countries also reported coming under fire. In Abu Dhabi, a drone was shot down near the Al Dhafra air base, which hosts U.S. forces, and shrapnel fell to the ground, wounding 6 people. Qatar evacuated residents near the U.S. embassy in Doha. Saudi Arabia said it destroyed a drone in its province bordering Jordan. American military personnel are stationed across these Gulf nations. This is not an abstract threat. This is a shooting war in which American soldiers and airmen are within striking distance of Iranian weapons. And yet the American public has been given almost no serious, sustained, primetime conversation about the true scope of what has been unleashed. Parliamentary activity in the Knesset was severely curtailed following the outbreak of the war with Iran on February 28th, initially limited to discussions of legislation linked to the 2026 state budget and the war itself. And then, in what is one of the most surreal political scenes you will ever read about, the Knesset voted on Israel's largest state budget in the country's history, a $271 billion spending bill, with the vote interrupted over and over again by sirens warning of incoming Iranian ballistic missiles, with lawmakers ultimately casting their votes from a fortified underground auditorium. Let that image land for a moment. Elected representatives of a democracy voting on the future of their country's finances, having to pause and take cover because missiles are flying overhead. Democracy literally under fire. And what was in that budget? The Defense Ministry received a record allocation, and the budget also sent billions of shekels to ultra-Orthodox educational institutions, institutions that train young men who are largely exempt from military service, even as other Israeli young people are fighting and dying in a war on multiple fronts. The internal political contradictions inside Israel have not paused for the war. If anything, the war has provided political cover for some of the most controversial legislation in Israeli history to move forward with reduced scrutiny. Critics called it governance in the shadows. A letter from the Israeli Legal Council accused the coalition of exploiting the war with Iran to advance controversial legislation, saying the Knesset is the house of the people and cannot become a place where decisions are made in the shadows during wartime. Now let's zoom out even further, because this is where the global morality piece comes in, and this is where I think we, as Americans, need to sit with some real discomfort. We are in a moment where the United States launched a war in which American bombs fell on Iranian soil, and the primary stated justification was Iran's nuclear program. The idea being that Iran was close to or had already achieved nuclear weapons capability and that preemptive military action was necessary to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. And yet, here's the detail that just hangs in the air. U.S. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee that Iran did not try to rebuild its nuclear enrichment program following the previous year's U.S. strikes on its nuclear facilities, seemingly contradicting President Trump's own stated justifications for this new expanded war. The intelligence community's own leadership is publicly contradicting the rationale for the war while the war is ongoing. That is an extraordinary thing. That deserves far more attention than it has received. And the humanitarian picture inside Iran, it is devastating, and it is almost entirely absent from the American media conversation. U.S. and Israeli forces have battered Iran with nationwide strikes. And meanwhile, Iranian emergency workers have been seen using bulldozers to clear rubble from residential buildings hit in earlier strikes in Tehran. Real people, real homes, real families. On both sides of this conflict, ordinary human beings are being killed and displaced by decisions made by political leaders who are, as one Israeli activist put it with devastating clarity, people who really don't care about them. Inside Israel, support for the war has remained strong according to polls. But exhaustion is growing and resentment is building as people feel their fates are being decided by distant leaders like Netanyahu and Trump, who have shown little investment in their welfare. The social fractures in Israeli society, which became so painfully visible during the Gaza war, are beginning to resurface. Kids aren't going to school, while employers are insisting their parents go to work. People are enduring multiple missile attacks daily, which means they aren't sleeping. Protests have attempted to form, but people are simply too exhausted to engage. What does it do to a society when the basic routines of daily life, sending your child to school, going to work, sleeping through the night, become impossible because of a war that your government chose to start? In Tel Aviv alone, 11% of residents do not have proper access to a shelter, according to a representative of the local municipality who addressed the Knesset. While locals complain to lawmakers that available shelters in the south of the city are overcrowded and suffer from neglect, vandalism, and sanitation problems, nearly 1 in 9 people in one of the most densely populated cities in the Middle East, a city that is now being hit by ballistic missiles on a near-daily basis, cannot get to a proper shelter in time when the sirens start screaming. That is a policy failure of staggering proportions. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Trump's top envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner reportedly negotiated with Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, a close associate of the slain IRGC Quds Force commander, who emerged as a leading wartime decision-maker after senior Iranian officials were eliminated in the Israeli-American campaign. So the administration launched a war partly justified by the argument that Iran's leadership was intolerable and is now negotiating with what remains of that leadership. And Trump, asked about the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran has partially blocked in retaliation, threatening a choke point for roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply, said it would be open immediately if a deal is reached. Diplomacy through destruction, war as leverage, and the rest of the world holding its breath to see whether the deal materializes before the economic damage becomes irreversible. The major airlines have already done the math. Air France extended its suspension of flights to and from Tel Aviv and Beirut, and Lufthansa extended its suspension of flights to Iran and parts of the Middle East for several more months, with services to Dubai and Tel Aviv on hold, and services to Abu Dhabi, Beirut, and Tehran suspended until October. Global aviation rerouting on a massive scale, oil prices surging, energy markets destabilized across the Gulf. And at the center of all of it, Tel Aviv, a city of beaches and tech startups and coffee shops and universities, now a city where residents run from siren to siren, where a parliament governs from a fortified bunker, where missiles tore gaping holes in apartment buildings on a Tuesday morning and left craters in the streets. This is not a distant conflict. This is not somebody else's problem. The United States is a direct military participant in this war. American weapons are falling on Iranian soil. American taxpayer money funds the missile defense systems trying to protect Israeli civilians. American diplomats are the ones trying to negotiate a way out, and the decisions being made in the coming days and weeks will shape the Middle East, global energy markets, and America's standing in the world for a generation. The least we can do the very least, is pay attention, ask hard questions, and demand from our leaders not just talking points, but the truth.